So welcome back. I want to continue thinking about the relationship between learning and memory. We had talked briefly, I'd introduced you briefly to this idea of the forgetting curve, Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. And I want to take that concept and relate it to teaching. What can we do about the forgetting? How can we counter that natural physiological process of us forgetting? This is the forgetting curve, if you recall. The forgetting curve shows how information is lost over time when there is no attempt to retain it. And you saw how very quickly this drops. 20 minutes after you learn something, if there's no review or anything, you've already lost 40% or more of what you knew at that point, and so on and so forth as it comes down. So how can we counter this? All right. So 6 days, roughly a week later, you've lost 75% of what you knew here. So we can think about it this way. So this would be a curve, and you notice down here that I've started essentially at 25%, so I've kind of dropped out that little bit here of the bottom of the graph. Retention percentage, this is how it would decline over a period of time. These are days after initial learning. So by day 6, it's down at about 25%. That's what normally would happen. However, if we give a review, let's say one day after our initial lesson, somehow gave a review, it does not have to be a very long review. In other words, you do not have to go over all that information again, everything, but provide some sort of review for the students, and at that time it's 100%, and then the curve drops down. But notice that the curve ends up over here at 6 days higher. Remember, this thing kind of levels off. It doesn't keep going down to 0 necessarily. So it keeps going like that. If we provide another review, let's say 2 days after the initial lesson, 1 day, 2 day, by day 6 it's here. They remember a lot more. By 3, do three reviews. Oh, now they're learning, their remembering is much higher. So we're countering this forgetting curve by providing these reviews. Remember, the idea of the forgetting curve is this is how we forget if nothing is done to help us retain that. Well, that's what the reviews are. We'll talk about the nature of those reviews here in a few moments. Now, there's another component to this, which is, I find very interesting. And that starts to help us think about how do I apply this idea that I just presented to our teaching. It's called the spacing effect. Learning is greater when studying is spread out over time, as opposed to studying the same amount of content at a single session. So here, we've got these spread out over time. So number of reviews, 1 through 5, again, starting, again, the lowest level of forgetting down here is about 25%. So here's the idea. If whatever this is, whether it's the next day after the initial learning or a week later or whatever the case may be, wherever they are on that curve, if we provide another 30-minute review, it pops back up here. But then, again, you get the same kind of curve coming down, and it's better, yes. But here's the trick. If you take that same 30 minutes and you separate it over this time, divide that up into 5 different components, 10 minutes review here, come back another time with a 5-minute review, another time with a 5-minute review, and so on and so forth. Look where we end up. We end up way over here. It's the same time frame, 30 minutes. We're all concerned about using time for review to take away from giving information. But if we parse that out, that 30-minute review, let me go back, it's much, much more effective in helping them retain and remember. We're countering, going in opposition to the forgetting curve and helping them remember better. So the spacing effect is an interesting and helpful way of expanding on this idea of reviewing. How do we do that rather than doing it in one big chunk? Perhaps we spread that out over time and help them remember things better. Okay, when should we do these reviews? Well, that depends. It depends on where you can fit them in. Clearly, if your exam is way out here somewhere another month later, maybe you want to spread these out more than simply 1 day after, 2 days after, or 3 days after, or maybe 1 day after, and then this one's a week later, and so on. Maybe you want to spread them out even a little bit more. So it depends upon how you're doing things and how you're organizing your module in your lessons, in your module. What should be the nature? What is the nature of these reviews? Well, these are the kinds of things that often we're going to go back to the ideas of the formative assessments that we've talked about, this idea of classroom assessment techniques, or CATs, active learning activities. So we're not talking about re-giving the lecture. We're talking about having those students do something with that knowledge at these different time points to help them bring that information back from their long-term memory. Then it goes back into long-term memory, and they remember things longer. How do we find time to do these reviews? This is something we all are concerned about. We pack our lectures, our teaching sessions full of information. How do we find time? How do we carve out the time to do these 10-minute, 5-minute reviews? This gets us back to the idea of the big idea. You may recall the big idea from earlier workshops. The big idea is something you sit down and you look at all your content for your module and say, well, what is the real big idea? What is the enduring understanding, the things that I really want them to end up with a year later, 2 years later, and so on, knowing. You also then identify, well, what's important to know and do that then bolsters this enduring learning. And then you identify, well, what else? Things that are only worth being familiar with. Remember, those are the things you get rid of. Those are the things that you don't teach. They're kind of tangential. They kind of sit over there by themselves. They don't really bolster the big idea, the enduring understanding, the things that are really important to know. That's where you get the time to integrate in these different reviews. So this wraps back into this idea of the big idea. So in conclusion, the forgetting curve can be countered by reviewing, rehearsing, repetition. And the spacing of those reviews, those repetitions, those rehearsals over time results in reducing the extent of forgetting. So again, parsing them out over time is important for thinking about in how you do it. Rather than just one big chunk of review, parsing it out over time is even more effective. So here's an assignment for you. What I want you to do is choose a lesson from one of the modules that you teach, a lesson that you feel is really critical, a really critical one for your module. Consider the most important component of that lesson, the most important thing the student should know or remember. So that gets back to the idea for that lesson, and what's the enduring understanding? What's the really important things to know? And then design for that information, for that really important component of the lesson, design a series of 3 or 4 brief, 5 or 10 minute long review activities. Again, don't re-lecture it. Some sort of activity, a CATS, a formative assessment, active learning activity, whatever the case may be, that asks those students to draw the information out of their long-term memory and use it somehow in this activity so that when it goes back in, it bolsters their memory, counters the forgetting curve. Do this in terms of review activities that you could offer at intervals after the initial lesson, and then how would you spread those out? The review activities out over the time from the initial lesson to the next learning evaluation, the next test, the next exam, the next quiz, whatever the case may be. So identify something that you're comfortable with, but choose a lesson in your module that you teach, you feel is a really critical one. Pick out an important component of that lesson, and then design several, 3 or 4, fairly short activities, review activities, that you could offer at intervals, and then how would you actually implement that in your module during that lesson.